Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Azure Fundamentals Practice Test Series. In this series of videos, we're going to discuss 25 critical questions that will help you clear the AZ-900 exam. We won't just give you the right answer. We'll explain why it is correct and also explain why the others are not correct. If you find this video helpful, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and click the bell so you don't miss the next practice test. Let's dive in and start building your cloud knowledge. Which Azure benefit allows you to only pay for the resources you consume? Correct answer. Pay as you go. Explanation. Pay as you go is a cloud billing model where you're charged only for the resources you actually use, instead of pre-purchasing hardware or committing to fixed capacity. This reduces upfront costs and increases flexibility. Why others are incorrect. High availability refers to ensuring applications are available most of the time, not a billing method. Scalability refers to adjusting resources up or down to meet demand, not payment structure. Elasticity refers to auto-adjusting resources based on demand, not the pricing model. Which Azure feature distributes incoming network traffic across multiple servers to improve availability? Correct answer. Azure Load Balancer. Explanation. Azure Load Balancer distributes network traffic across multiple virtual machines or services, ensuring no single resource is overwhelmed and improving uptime. Why others are incorrect. Azure Traffic Manager routes traffic based on DNS to different endpoints, not for internal load balancing of resources. Azure Virtual Network creates a private network but doesn't balance traffic. Azure Firewall protects resources by filtering traffic, not distributing it. Which of the following is an example of platform as a service? Correct answer. Azure SQL Database Explanation. Azure SQL Database is a PaaS offering where Microsoft manages the database engine, scaling, patching, and high availability, leaving the user to focus on data and queries. Why others are incorrect. Azure Virtual Machine, IaaS, as you manage the OS and software yourself. Azure Blob Storage, storage service, not a PaaS compute environment. Azure Data Center, physical infrastructure, not a cloud service model. Which Azure service is designed to store unstructured data like images or videos? Correct answer. Azure Blob Storage Explanation. Azure Blob Storage stores large amounts of unstructured data, such as media files, backups, or logs, in object storage format. Why others are incorrect. Azure Files, for shared file storage with SMB protocol. Azure Table Storage, for structured NoSQL data. Azure SQL Database, for relational structured data. Which Azure service helps you manage governance by enforcing rules on resources? Correct answer. Azure Policy Explanation. Azure Policy lets you create, assign, and enforce rules, policies, to ensure resources meet compliance requirements, like restricting VM sizes or requiring tags. Why others are incorrect. Azure Blueprints combines policies, role assignments, and templates into repeatable deployments, but isn't focused solely on enforcement. Azure Resource Manager deploys and manages Azure resources but doesn't enforce compliance rules. Azure Monitor tracks performance and logs, not policy compliance. Which Azure service is used to host and manage containerized applications? Correct answer. Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. Explanation. AKS is a managed Kubernetes container orchestration service for deploying, scaling, and managing containerized applications. Why others are incorrect. Azure Functions, serverless compute for event-driven code. Azure App Service, runs web apps but not full Kubernetes orchestration. Azure Logic Apps, automates workflows, not container hosting. Which type of cloud deployment combines on-premises infrastructure with cloud resources? Correct answer, hybrid cloud. Explanation. Hybrid cloud integrates on-premises data centers with cloud services, enabling shared workloads and data movement between both environments. Why others are incorrect. Public cloud only uses resources in the cloud provider's infrastructure. Private cloud, dedicated to a single organization, not mixed with public cloud. Multi-cloud uses multiple cloud providers, not necessarily on premises. Which Azure service allows you to create virtual private networks in Azure? Correct answer, Azure Virtual Network, VNet. Explanation. Azure VNet enables secure communication between Azure resources and on-premises environments via a logically isolated network in Azure. Why others are incorrect. Azure Firewall provides network security, not network creation. Azure VPN Gateway connects VNets or on-premises networks via VPN. Azure ExpressRoute provides private fiber connections, not virtual network creation. Which tool provides a web-based portal for managing Azure resources? Correct answer, Azure Portal. Explanation. Azure Portal is a graphical, web-based interface for managing Azure resources. Why others are incorrect. Azure CLI, command line tool, not a web interface. Azure PowerShell, script-based management, not graphical. Azure Resource Manager, deployment framework, not a management interface. Which Azure pricing calculator helps estimate the total cost of ownership when moving to Azure? Correct answer, Azure TCO calculator. Explanation. The Azure Total Cost of Ownership (TCO) calculator estimates the cost savings of migrating workloads to Azure compared to on-premises environments. Why others are incorrect. Azure Pricing Calculator estimates costs for Azure services, not migration savings. Azure Cost Management monitors and analyzes costs after deployment. Azure Advisor gives recommendations for cost, security, and performance optimization. Which Azure service is best for running small pieces of code without managing servers? Correct answer, Azure Functions. Explanation. Azure Functions is a serverless compute service that executes code in response to events without requiring you to manage or provision servers. You pay only for the execution time. Why others are incorrect. Azure Kubernetes Service manages containers, not serverless event-driven code. Azure App Service runs web apps, but you still manage scaling and environment settings. Azure Batch runs large-scale batch computing jobs, not small event-driven functions. Which option describes the responsibility of the customer in a platform as a service PaaS model? Correct answer, managing application data. Explanation. In PaaS, the cloud provider manages infrastructure, OS, and runtime. The customer manages the application and its data. Why others are incorrect. Managing the operating system, done by the provider in PaaS. Managing physical servers, handled by the provider. Managing networking hardware, provider's responsibility. Which Azure service helps protect applications from distributed denial of service, DDoS attacks? Correct answer, Azure DDoS Protection. Explanation. Azure DDoS Protection shields Azure applications from large-scale, malicious traffic floods by filtering harmful requests before they reach services. Why others are incorrect. Azure Firewall secures network traffic but doesn't specialize in DDoS mitigation. Azure Security Center manages overall security posture, not specifically DDoS. Azure Sentinel, SIEM tool for threat detection and incident response. Which Azure storage option is ideal for storing large volumes of structured NoSQL data? Correct answer, Azure Table Storage. Explanation. Azure Table Storage stores structured NoSQL data as key value pairs, ideal for datasets that don't require relational database features. Why others are incorrect. Azure Blob Storage for unstructured data. Azure Files for SMB-based shared file storage. Azure Queue Storage for message storage and asynchronous communication, not structured data. Which Azure tool helps you monitor application performance and detect issues in real time? Correct answer. Azure Monitor. Explanation. Azure Monitor collects metrics, logs, and traces from Azure resources and applications to track health, performance, and reliability. Why others are incorrect. Azure Policy enforces governance rules, not performance monitoring. Azure Security Center manages security posture. Azure Resource Manager manages deployments, not monitoring. Which Azure feature allows automatic scaling of resources based on demand? Correct answer. Elasticity explanation. Elasticity automatically adjusts computing resources to match workload demand, scaling up during peak use and scaling down during low demand. Why others are incorrect. Availability zones provide fault isolation for resilience, not scaling. Redundancy, duplication for fault tolerance, not scaling. Pay-as-you-go, billing model, not scaling capability. What does Azure provide to ensure geographic disaster recovery? Correct answer, region pairs. Explanation. Azure pairs regions within the same geography for replication and disaster recovery. If one region goes down, services can fail over to the paired region. Why others are incorrect. Availability zones offer resilience within a region, not across geographies. Resource groups, logical grouping of resources, not DR strategy. Express route, private network connection, not DR. Which Azure service provides identity and access management for resources? Correct answer. Azure Active Directory, Azure AD. Explanation. Azure AD is a cloud-based identity and access management service that manages authentication and authorization for Azure resources and applications. Why others are incorrect. Azure Key Vault stores and manages secrets, not user identities. Azure Security Center monitors security, not identity management. Azure Policy enforces governance rules, not identity. Which pricing model gives the lowest cost for workloads with predictable usage over 1 or 3 years? Correct answer. Reserved instances explanation. Reserved instances provide significant discounts for committing to a specific VM type for 1 or 3 years, ideal for predictable workloads. Why others are incorrect. Pay as you go, flexible but more expensive for steady workloads. Spot instances, cheapest for interruptible workloads, not predictable ones. Consumption-based, general term for pay per use, not a discounted commitment plan. Which Azure service is designed for event-driven message routing between applications? Correct answer. Azure Event Grid. Explanation. Azure Event Grid is a fully managed event routing service for building event-based architectures. It connects publishers to subscribers in real time. Why others are incorrect. Azure Service Bus, messaging service for reliable delivery, not event routing. Azure Queue Storage stores messages for later processing, not event distribution. Azure Logic Apps automates workflows, not specialized event routing. Which Azure service allows you to securely store and manage application secrets like passwords and API keys? Correct answer, Azure Key Vault explanation. Azure Key Vault securely stores secrets, certificates, and encryption keys, allowing controlled access and audit logging. Why others are incorrect. Azure Security Center manages security posture, not secret storage. Azure Active Directory handles identity and access management, not secrets. Azure Policy enforces governance rules, not secure storage. Which Azure service should you use to create and manage virtual machines? Correct answer, Azure Virtual Machines. Explanation. Azure Virtual Machines lets you deploy and manage scalable compute instances in the cloud. Why others are incorrect. Azure Compute, a broad category, not a specific VM service. Azure Resource Manager manages resource deployment, not specifically VMs. Azure Kubernetes Service manages containers, not full VMs. Which Azure service provides recommendations to optimize performance, security, and cost? Correct answer, Azure Advisor. Explanation. Azure Advisor analyzes your resources and usage to recommend improvements in cost efficiency, security, performance, and reliability. Why others are incorrect. Azure Cost Management tracks and analyzes expenses, but doesn't recommend optimizations across all domains. Azure Monitor observes performance metrics, but doesn't give optimization advice. Azure Policy enforces governance, not optimization. Which Azure tool lets you deploy infrastructure as code using templates in JSON format? Correct answer, Azure Resource Manager ARM templates. Explanation, ARM templates define Azure infrastructure in JSON for automated, consistent deployments. Why others are incorrect. Azure CLI, command line tool for manual deployments, not template-based automation. Azure DevOps, CI/CD toolset, not specifically for ARM templates. Azure Blueprints, packages ARM templates with policies and role assignments for repeatable environments. Which Azure service can you use to ensure compliance with security standards like ISO 27001? Correct answer, Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Explanation, Microsoft Defender for Cloud, formerly Azure Security Center, provides compliance monitoring, security assessments, and recommendations for meeting standards like ISO 27001. Why others are incorrect. Azure Policy enforces governance but doesn't give compliance assessments. Azure Monitor tracks metrics, not compliance. Azure Sentinel, SIEM tool for threat detection, not compliance.